right now, despite decades of free trade, where capital has been able to fly across borders at the blink of an eye, doesn't it seem harder and harder to go live and work in some countries, even those countries that are like really close allies, even in the United States, which we have a free trade agreement in? Now, under the old days of the old Commonwealth, you might remember, we had basically a shared passport. Now, James Skinner is a British expat living in Vancouver, and he wants to change that. The reason is that James has had a lot of problems trying to live and work in old Commonwealth countries. So he has this idea that let's create an open labor market between the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. I think it's a pretty great idea. Let's get James on to hear more about it, and I've reached him in Vancouver tonight. James, thanks for making the time.
No worries. Thank you for having me on.
Well, I think this is a really great idea, the idea of free mobility between Commonwealth nations. Where did you first hit upon the idea?
So it's a bit of a long story, so I'll try and keep it as short as possible, really. I left the UK, where I'm originally from, back in 2011 to head to Melbourne in Australia. And I basically created a life for myself out there, found myself a job with a good salary, a good circle of friends, social clubs, sports clubs, created a life for myself out there, basically, and I wanted nothing more than to stay there. And I felt at home there as well, simply because of the close cultural connections that, Australians have to the Brits. And unfortunately, it just wasn't, it wasn't possible simply because of the difficulties in terms of the immigration status out there. And even though I'm living here now in Vancouver, it's kind of a similar situation. I've created a life for myself, apartment, job, circle of friends, everything involved. And even though I'd love nothing more than to stay in Vancouver because it's a tremendous city and I love the place, the possibility of me staying is very slim indeed, simply because of the difficulties in terms of immigration law. So really, like back in November 2014, I came up with the idea that, something deserves to change for this, and it's not just me going through this situation. There's thousands upon thousands of people from the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand going through the same thing who, find a new home for themselves within these 4 Commonwealth countries and are, incapable of staying due to what I feel is unfair immigration, rules against them.
Yeah, I think a lot of people might be really surprised given our, traditional connections between those countries inside the Commonwealth. So let's go to the Australian case, and then we can talk about the Canadian case. What are they telling you in terms of why you weren't able to stay, why you weren't able to get permanent residency or even citizenship?
In terms of Australia, at the moment, Australia, back in 2011 anyway, it was a strong sort of support for getting people out there in terms of like a skilled trade. Unfortunately, even though my role is kind of classed as a skilled trade in Canada, it was not classed as a skilled trade in Australia at that time. And as far as I'm aware, it's not classed as a skilled trade at this moment. I currently work in legal services. In Australia, that was not actually possible for me to obtain permanent residency through that, even though I was working in an established law firm, like I say, a good job and a good career and a good salary as well. But unfortunately, it wasn't actually on the skilled occupations list that Australia has. So.
And in Canada, even though you're on that list, it's still somewhat dubious whether or not you're going to be able to stay permanently?
It very much is, yes. As I'm sure a lot of Canadians are aware, the Canadian government changed the immigration rules as of January the 1st, 2015, to the new express entry system, which has its benefits in terms of streamlining a lot of people to come to Canada and work in skilled professions. And even though I qualify for that entry protocol, the reality is that it's still going to be very difficult for me to be able to stay here. And that's also the case with a lot of people that we have spoken to and who have gone in contact with us as well, not just in Canada, but also, in terms of the Australian model as well. They feel at home, they have a good skilled background, an educated background, and yet the immigration challenges for them are too great for them to stay in the place that they want to call home. So that's the main thing that we're trying to overturn here is to basically allow people who feel at home in a Commonwealth country, who want to make a difference in society and want to be part of that society and integrate and assimilate, these people deserve to stay there, and simply because of the close Commonwealth connections that we have.
Not to take away from this argument or to distract from the argument, but I do note it's just a bit of an irony. In the last 25 years, Canada's really pursued a free trade policy. We're currently negotiating one with the European Union. Of course, we've had one with the United States since the late 80s. And while capital has been able to flow across borders instantaneously, it's just gotten harder and harder for labor to move across those borders. And again, not to get too deep into a philosophical or political debate, but I mean, one of the main points about free trade was that capital and labor should be able to move. Otherwise, capital would too easily be able to prey upon labor. And that's a bit of a side note, but nevertheless, it's interesting. Granted, we don't have free trade agreements yet between the UK and Canada, or Canada and Australia, but capital can move so at almost a blink of an eye. Meanwhile, it seems to get harder and harder for us to go work in each other's countries.
Exactly, yeah, and that's exactly the point that we're making. As an organization, we're also very supportive of free trade. We're very supportive of free trade within the European Union, for example, but at the same time, we also support the initiative that is, for example, between Australia and New Zealand as well, whereby, they do have trade agreements, and of course they also have the freedom of movement agreement, which is an informal agreement between the two countries, allowing citizens to move freely between them. Entitled the Trans-Tasman Travel Arrangement. So it's something similar along those lines that we are also promoting and advocating for, basically for the benefit of the freedom of movement of citizens as well.
Yeah, every time you meet someone from the EU, I'm always so jealous because of that passport. They can go to each other's countries, live and work really indefinitely. Again, an incredibly enviable position that they're in. So why has it not ever really come up between our nations? What are sort of the blocks that have come up between opening up labor mobility even amongst these four pretty similar countries?
It's a very good question, actually, and we get asked that quite a lot. I mean, believe it or not, it never actually used to be the case between, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Pre-1945, like any citizen of the Commonwealth, I believe, could have moved freely within the Commonwealth. And of course, not going too far back into history, but we actually had a similar thing right up until 1973, where UK citizens, for example, could pretty much integrate and assimilate into Australian society in the same way before the UK actually joined the European Economic Community. And this is somewhat of a sore topic for, especially the UK, seeing as we turned our back on our Commonwealth relations in favor of relations with the European Union, which, in my personal opinion anyway, we have far less in common with than what we do with, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. So it never used to be, the way that it is right now, in terms of difficult immigration and the difficulties that we have with, the free movement. But it's something, along the lines of history that we are trying to, return the model back to, back to the pre-1973 model where we could actually, integrate with each other and assimilate and also have, aspects of freedom of movement also.
Okay, let me put up some potential arguments against it. I can hear perhaps a racial argument against just opening labor mobility between these four countries, i.e. majority white countries. Could there not be an argument to be made that if you allowed free labor mobility between the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, without extending that to other countries, that it's somewhat, racist?
We do. I mean, we've never actually brought up the race card ever. Myself nor my team, we have never ever brought up the race card. We never ever will, because that's not something that we are advocating whatsoever. And I'll make that abundantly clear. In fact, if we were simply to be promoting this amongst predominantly Caucasian countries within the Commonwealth, we would have probably brought Cyprus and Malta into the Union as well. But you'll notice that we have not. The main reason we are focused on the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand is simply because they are so similar in so many ways that a union between these four countries would simply work. We share the same head of state, we share the same native language, we share the same respect for democracy, the same respect for the rule of law. We share the same parliamentary-style Westminster system. We share the same common law legal system. We have very good economic growth rates, very positive human rights records, very good crime control prevention methods. The list goes on and on. We are so similar in so many ways that we honestly and genuinely believe that a union between these four countries would work so well. Because we are so similar, citizens with a free movement initiative would be able to, assimilate and integrate within society very easily. Now, we do get asked, quite a bit, why doesn't South Africa, perhaps join the union? And it's a good question. We're not saying that we're strictly against any other countries coming into the future. I mean, by all means, we're all for, governments potentially negotiating with other Commonwealth countries to perhaps join this union were it to ever form. But, for example, if I may take South Africa as a key example, I personally have a lot of South African friends, and, South Africans, a tremendous country, and it's made great strides in the last decade or so, in terms of socioeconomic abilities. But at the same time, one perfect example is the homicide rate in South Africa is currently 31 times greater than that of the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Now, if we are to have a free movement initiative between these countries, we need to be careful as to who we integrate and annex, simply because of these factors that may produce negative results in the long run. So, I mean, by all means, we are fully supportive of the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand integrating under a free movement initiative, but at the same time, we're not against other countries joining in the future, at the discretion of the governments, of course. If the governments decide and negotiate for that, we're not going to tread on their toes and say that they can't do it. However, we do promote that there should be a certain criteria met for countries to come into any freedom of movement initiatives that we have, in the same way as the European Union also has a criteria for countries to come and join as a member state as well. So, by all means, as it stands right now, we're very happy with it to simply be UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand at the moment. But at the same time, any countries that would want to come in the future would, in our opinion, need to meet a certain criteria to join.
Sure. Now, again, I think it's a really good idea. That said, you even see bilateral trade negotiations drag on for years, if not decades. I can only imagine trying to negotiate this treaty between four countries might be all of an impossibility. I mean, even getting Canadian provinces on board on any one single issue is pretty difficult. How much have you had in terms of uptake from any of the governments in any of those countries?
We've recently submitted the petition that we released online, which currently has, I believe, over 55,000 signatures, and we recently released that to members of Parliament within New Zealand. Of course, we only did this, simply a matter of about 15 hours ago. So,
okay.
The results obviously are very young, and I'd be happy to get back to you with any results that we find, of course. But before we did all this, about a month or so ago, we actually did a certain sample of politicians in the UK who we did release this to. And the response was actually very good. A lot of them actually supported what we were saying. Predominantly, I hate to say it, but a lot of them did say, this is something that we do support, but could you possibly get back to us once the election is done? Which is, of course, fair enough. The UK has an election coming up on May the 15th, and, these politicians, they have bigger fish to fry, which is perfectly understandable. We understand that. So we're not going to, try and advocate for it, while they've got, other things on the table at the same time. But, the response has been very positive from that sample of politicians that we released it to. Again, like I say, it's early days in terms of, when we released it to the New Zealand Parliament, so we're waiting to hear back from them as well. But we anticipate support for that will be very good, simply because, the petition that we released, which has had 55,000 signatures, a lot of those people who signed were actually New Zealanders as well. Of course, a lot of them, it's very evenly distributed amongst the four countries, but of course, for that reason, a lot of them were from New Zealand too. So we're anticipating good support from every government that we will eventually release this petition to, and a lot of support from the government as well in terms of the initiative that we're promoting too. So it's a lot of work to be done, but it's something that we're going to be working for in the future, definitely.
Well, James, I think it's a great idea, and I appreciate you joining me tonight.
No worries. I appreciate you having me on the show. Thank you very much.
That's James Skinner, founder, executive director of the Commonwealth Freedom of Movement Organization. We're going to pause for a break. It's At Night on the Chorus Radio Network.